Welcome back to episode 214 of Tall Boy Radio. And as we always say, who knows where it goes when the beer flows? Well, maybe this week it is flowing all the way to the seventh circle of hell. Or at least Gaz's house anyway. How you doing, Gaz?
Yeah, I'm okay, dude. All good. I've got a little struck down with a little bit of the lurgy, which is obviously why, for those keen observers of our podcast, which is why you probably realise that me, myself, and Beans aren't in the same place recording. Yeah, a bit of the lurgy, but I'm feeling good. I'm looking forward to this. Looking forward to this episode. Always great when we have guests on. Always great when we have returning guests on. So yes, looking forward to this.
Indeed, yeah. So a returning guest, as Gaz has trailed it there. He's quite right. And the last time that we were joined by this particular lady, we were talking about witchcraft. We'll find out if that is going to be the topic tonight. Lynzie, how are you doing?
Hello, yeah, I'm good, thank you. It's nice to see you again.
Indeed, it's good to have you back.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like we might be in for that. Do you remember the Toffee Crisp advert a few years ago where they were in a seance and the Toffee Crisp wrapper came fluttering down from the sky? You never know, something like that might happen. It might sort out our audio, or we might have some strange voices, but then again, probably not, because it's all very mundane.
No, maybe. And if we do have that happening, then Gaz will see it about 4 or 5 seconds after we do, because he's having a few visual issues tonight. So did you want to tell us?
Which will detract from the authenticity of it all, and we won't be able to sell it to the BBC because it'll all look like it's staged.
Of course.
That's the last thing that you want is you two to have a massive reaction. I'm just like this.
It does look funny. So, Lynzie, then. So tonight we've called this episode The Last Witch of Scotland. And I know you're not a big fan you won't be a big fan of the video artwork that we've used, but I promise you when the audio comes out, you'll quite like the picture that I've used on there, I can promise. It's much more authentic.
Okay. I didn't really have a problem with the picture you had already.
That's good. It's a bit cheesy. It was a bit cheesy, I thought, to be honest. But, it hopefully hooks people in to watch it.
So the reason this one came about was last time I was on, we talked about the Pendle witches, and I told you some stories about, witches in general, James I, a little boy who was late for his supper and got into trouble, so we made up a massive story about horses and greyhounds and hares and bread that came down from the ceiling, etc., etc. And someone asked in the chat who was the last person tried under the Witchcraft Act in the UK. So that's where the idea for this show came around. I'm quite good on the Pendle witches, but I can by no means claim to be an expert on Helen Duncan, or the last witch of Scotland, as you've called her. So it's all very conversational, this. So I thought we would start with a little tour through the Witchcraft Act from the 16th century onwards, until probably 2008 or something. Wow. Surprisingly, and then have a little chat about this case that happened in the 1940s with Helen Duncan.
Yeah, definitely. And just as a quick one, Gaza, don't you think the 1940s seems awfully late to have somebody prosecuted under the Witchcraft Act?
Awfully late, yeah. I mean, if you'd have asked me without obviously sort of doing a bit of reading, and I possibly would have said maybe sort of turn of the century at the latest sort of thing, maybe 1910, 1920. If you went down the typical sort of Lovecraftian era and you think, okay, the occult and witches and that, I mean, that was obviously huge around that sort of time and stuff. So I don't know, I'd have said possibly 1900, maybe 1920, but definitely not 1940s. No, I'd have thought that was way too late.
Definitely. So before we get to that then, Lynzie, tell us a little bit about this Witchcraft Act that this poor lady, this poor hellish Nell fell foul of.
Well, what I was just going to say to Gaza, actually, it sounds really surprising that it was kind of still hanging around in the 1940s, 1950s, but actually there's a legacy still lurking around well into the 21st century as well. So we'll touch on that briefly at some point. Wow. But yeah, so the Witchcraft Act. The first, everybody knows about Henry VIII, or most people know about Henry VIII, and how he had a really big struggle with religion as part of his reign. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, who was a Catholic lady, and decided that he wanted to divorce her. So he had to find a really good, compelling reason to do that, and ultimately completely managed to divorce himself not only from Queen Catherine, but from the Catholic Church and Rome itself. So he started the Church of England and the Protestant Church as we kind of have inherited it in these days. So his reign was very much categorized by this duality between God and the devil, good and evil, and what's the right way to worship God, what's the right way to do religion. And part of that journey was Parliament passing the first Witchcraft Act in 1542. And it was the first time that witchcraft was made punishable by death. So there's a quote here that's a bit long-winded and a bit wordy, but it defined witchcraft as a person who would use, devise, practice, or exercise, or cause to be devised, practiced, or exercised, any invocations or conjurations of sprites or spirits, witchcrafts, enchantments, or sorceries, to the intent to find money or treasure, or to waste, consume, or destroy any person in his body members, or to provoke any person to unlawful love, which sounds a bit dodgy, or for any other unlawful intent or purpose, or for despite of Christ, or for lucre of money, dig up or pull down any cross or crosses, or by such invocations or conjurations of spirits, witchcrafts, enchantments, or sorceries, or any of them, take upon them to tell or declare where goods stolen or lost shall become. So basically, you weren't allowed to do any sorcery, any witchcraft, tear down any crosses, say bad things about God, or to try and guess where stolen goods were hidden. So that was the Witchcraft Act in just a few words, or 20,000 as the Parliament had it at the time.
Oh my word! I tell you what, I'm pretty sure we could get Gaz on a couple of those things.
You're probably right.
On that. Are you a witch?
I don't believe so.
Just the sort of thing a witch would say, that is.
So then that Witchcraft Act was revoked, and a new one came into power in 1562 under the reign of Elizabeth I. And this became known as the Act Against Conjurations, Enchantments and Witchcrafts, which wordage will sound a bit familiar by now. So this one was a little bit more gentle, and in this act, only those people who were actually guilty of causing harm were executed. So previously, under the last century's act, you could be put to death for pretending, for doing any of those things that I've listed in those long words. Whereas now, under Queen Elizabeth, you could only really be put to death if you hurt someone or killed somebody. So you could go to jail for lesser crimes like putting a spell on your neighbour's milk or whatever. However, after 1562, records of homicides or murders caused by witchcraft start to appear in the public record. So in all, since then, 228 murders have been deemed to have been done or enacted by witchcraft. So about 17 of those were done by the Pendle witches that we talked about last time. So 157 people were accused of homicide under the Witchcraft Act. About half of them were acquitted, but only 9 were men. So mostly witchcraft, as you probably could guess, is a woman's crime. So all those evil women doing wicked things.
What do you mind if I ask? Sorry, just interrupt. Why was that? You know, and maybe I've played a little bit too much Dungeons and Dragons. But is a male witch a warlock or something like that?
Yeah, some people disagree with the term warlock. If you're a witch, you're a witch. And actually, around about this time, the definition of a witch was somebody who'd made a pact with the devil. So that could be a man or a woman.
Okay.
But there's a lot of misogyny floating around at the time. People didn't want nosy, gobby, kind of opinionated women sticking in the nose in where they weren't wanted, saying what's what, etc. Women were supposed to be meek and mild and serve their husbands and stay discreetly in the home and clean stuff, or basically run the entire homestead while the husbands went off doing whatever. So yeah, misogyny is the answer in short. So anyway, at the same time, Scotland has its own Witchcraft Act of 1563. And in the Scottish Act, being a witch, as well as consulting with witches, could lead you to being sentenced to death. So not only did you have to, have your pet toad and your cauldron and supposedly make spells and have pacts with the devil, if you went round your local witch's house and asked her for help, then that could also put you at risk of being prosecuted as well. So it's quite interesting, going back to my question to Gaza before, that you're in different houses tonight, so you can't be spotted.
That's correct.
I put a pentagram on my door to keep him out.
Yeah.
That might encourage him in.
Yeah, probably would.
So in 1603, James I comes to the throne, and there's another Witchcraft Act, which now included anyone who invoked evil spirits or communed with familiars. So familiars are your toads and rats and hedgehogs and all kinds of other unlikely creatures that witches were known to shapeshift into to conduct their dark deeds and escape off into the fields. So it was all about, at that time, I don't know if you remember, James I wrote a book called Demonology in the 1590s, where he kind of laid out this big picture or plan for what a witch was. It was where the witch made the pact with the devil, and they had a mark on their body where the devil could suck and, receive sustenance from. All of this came straight from him. And this act was all about dealing with evil and wicked spirits. So this is where the kind of tone of the story of the Pendle Witches comes from. And around the same time, interestingly, James I had married his wife, a Danish lady, in the 1590s. And as they were sailing back from Denmark to England, massive storms blew up, and he had been brought up in this whole culture and family stories about witches who were out to get you, and he was the heir to the throne, so he was at massive risk from anyone seeking to undermine him in any way. Witches were a really big fear for him, and he became convinced that witches from both sides of the North Sea had tried to blow up these storms to sink his ship, to destroy him and prevent him becoming King of England. He survived, the Queen survived, but roughly about 100 people from North Berwick and the coast in that direction were tried for witchcraft. So the North Berwick trials were very famous in Scottish witchcraft history. So this kind of links to Helen Duncan, who we'll get to in a little while, because her story starts with the sinking of a boat in the 20th century. So the Witchcraft Act then went through another couple of kind of evolutions in 1735, where we get to a time of enlightenment. Witchcraft is now kind of considered an impossible crime. So people by this point had kind of got to a point in their thinking where they're like, well, how can someone cause someone to die just by putting a spell on them or whatever? It just wasn't feasible anymore. So the Act now still existed as a Witchcraft Act, but it punished those who were pretending to be witches rather than people who actually said that they were witches.
That makes sense. That makes a little bit of sense, because, when you said that, like back in 1735, if they're recognizing that it's impossible, then we're going to deal or talk about someone in the 1940s. You do have to ask how. How, if it's 1730, they can realize that this is beyond reasonable expectation? Could we be looking at the case of a woman who was unfortunately got herself into a little spot of bother with the law in the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah, but you'd be surprised at the level of belief that is still there, although with a slightly different focus. So it's not so much the kind of lizard boiling wing of bat type stuff of James I, but it's there nonetheless. Sorry, guys.
No, I was just going to say, because going back, I mean, myself and Beans are 50, so probably going back maybe when we were at school. So even, about 30 years ago, 35 years ago, so there was a huge sort of resurgence in, was it Wicca? And there was loads of, and actually thinking about it, really sort of stereotypically, maybe misogynistic, but girls that were talking about Wicca, and there was a big sort of craze of that. Now, I, at the time, obviously completely naive and didn't understand Wicca and witchcraft and wizardry and all of that. But I wonder whether, and just thinking back, I wonder whether or not, and you'll probably be able to tell us, is there an act still in place? I mean, we'll get to that, but I'm starting to think, is there an act still in place now? And it might be worded in a slightly different way. It might not be called a witchcraft act, but I don't know. Is there an equivalent nowadays as to what it was back in either the 40s or the turn of the century or 1700s? You know, so, but it just got me thinking then about, has it gone more, this is going to sound a horrible phrase, like underground, and like there are still people that still worship it and still, I'd say, perform witchcraft, if that's even a phrase. I don't know. But we'll probably get onto that. But just then what you were saying, it just got me thinking about when you said it was a lot more prevalent than perhaps we realise, is it just got me thinking then about actually back in the day when myself and Beans were a bit younger, it actually was, and kids, I suppose, were talking about it.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting that you should say that, because whilst there isn't a witchcraft act today, and whilst there are lots of people who identify as witches, or they just have a passing interest in witchcraft and the dark arts, as it were, and there's lots of people. You mentioned Dungeons and Dragons, so there's this whole fantasy culture that you can be kind of, you can go down that rabbit hole. It's really, really interesting as a subculture. But some people like myself, like to study the history of witchcraft. Some people practice witchcraft, so they do make spells and invocations. Wicca is not necessarily the same as witchcraft, but definitions around the difference between Wicca and witchcraft are really difficult. Wicca is all about ceremonial magic and relationship with the earth, which doesn't necessarily feed into many people who identify as witches is practice. That's not very good grammar, is it? But hey, witches is.
So is Wicca, is that more akin to paganism then?
That's really difficult. So again, paganism is quite difficult to pin down as well. Some people consider paganism to be religion that isn't Christianity, or religion that predates Christianity and is all about gods and goddesses. So from the Romans and the Greeks and other ancient civilizations. There's a big resurgence of interest about Nordic and Scandinavian religion, that kind of brand of paganism, if you like, if that's not a really offensive way of putting it. But yeah, all of these terms come up, don't they? And it's really difficult to know exactly what they are.
Yeah.
But paganism, Wicca, and witchcraft aren't necessarily anything to do with each other, and yet they are.
Yeah, that's interesting. We had a guest, didn't we, Gaz? A lady by, I can't forget her real name, to be honest, but she goes by Mystic Primrose on Instagram, and she sells.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she sells.
The White Witch. Is that the one that we...
Don't call her a White Witch. I got in trouble for that on the episode. She's just a witch.
Right, okay. Right, scrub that. Edit that out, dude. I didn't say that, really.
Yeah, she didn't appreciate it. But nonetheless, she was still very congenial with us.
She probably gave better definitions than I did.
No, very simple.
It might be worth revisiting.
Because I think, I mean, I don't exactly remember, but I'm sure that we would have asked a similar type of question in terms of witchcraft, Wicca, paganism. Is it just a form of religion, and just in terms of it's just Christianity is God and witchcraft is something else? So I'm sure we would have asked that, and I can't for the life remember what the answer was, but we probably would have asked very similar questions.
Yeah, I don't think with witchcraft, especially modern witchcraft, has lots of kind of chapters and lots of different types. So you can have traditional witchcraft, you can have folkloric witchcraft that draws all of its stories and reasoning from the folklore that came about as part of the witch trials. Some people consider the age-old definition of a witch as someone who had a pact with the devil as being the right one, but actually Satanism and things like that don't necessarily form part of the modern witches' thinking or cosmology. It's a very individual thing.
Right.
Can I ask a quick question about witches' familiars?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, and I will apologise in advance for this question, because my awareness for this subject comes from Sabrina the Teenage Witch.
Okay.
So she had a familiar called Salem Saberhagen. This isn't part of my
Right.
notes; just in the back of my brain somewhere. So she had a familiar called Salem Saberhagen, who was the little black cat that followed around and was quite witty and cutting with his remarks. And the idea was that was a spirit that was born back into the body of an animal. Is that loosely based on the idea of what a familiar is?
Yeah, absolutely. So many people, and could be forgiven for doing so, would confuse a familiar with a pet. So a witch wouldn't be said just to have like a pet black cat or a pet rat or what have you. The creature was a manifestation, as you said, of something from the spirit world that would come and provide help or services, or could be sent out to do evil deeds somewhere. So the Pendle witches, for example, all had familiars, and you could really argue that was fed to them straight from the magistrates who were putting words into their mouth, having read Demonology by James I.
Yeah.
So if the magistrate, say, asks you if you've got a toad called Richard who brings you beer every night, then yeah, you probably did have a familiar called Richard who was a toad who bought beer. Because you'd get...
That sounds cool. Where'd you get one?
I know, it would be really cool, wouldn't it? But they had spirits who would appear to them in the form of boys or dogs. So one of the witches had a big brown dog called Ball. Old Demdike, for example, had a boy called Tib who would appear to her, and he wore a coat that one half of the coat was black and the other half was brown. And he would bring food. And old Chattox, one of the other witches, had a familiar called Fancy, and Fancy and Tib were said to have bought them butter and cheese and flesh, as it were, which I believe is just like lamb chops or whatever, rather than human flesh to feast on.
Just a quick question then. So in terms of familiar, then, would the familiar or always manifest itself in the same form, or could a familiar take different forms? So would it always be a cat, or would that familiar sometimes be a cat and then not be a cat and be seen to manifest itself in a different form, so a frog or a rat or whatever it may be, or is it always just that one form for that one witch?
It seems to be that they have very distinct characters, so it's either a dog or a boy or a horse or whatever. I think the main thing is that they weren't pets. So you can't see her, but on the armchair here next to me, there is a little husky cross who is a pet, but she'd be really useless as a familiar. She wouldn't be able to help me with food. She wouldn't be able to go and get things from the spirit world for me. She's not very good at following orders. She's a bit dim. So yeah, she's very much a pet. She's not useful in any way, and she certainly isn't going to take messages to and from the devil for me.
That's largely how my wife describes me.
She's also not going to turn into a cat, so she does have a fixed form. But I don't know. Maybe there are tales where familiars have appeared as hares. If the witch can turn into a hare and escape off down the field, there's no reason why she couldn't turn into a bat the next day. Or
it just made me curious in terms of, because you see some of the films, and you can be hiking along a road and all of a sudden somebody sees something and says, oh, that's whoever, that's such and such looking after me, looking over me, and then half an hour later it's a different form. It's like it's the form of a horse or something else, and I just wondered whether or not is there that manifestation in different physical forms, or is it generally that one form that is associated with that one witch sort of thing. But
I suspect that it depends on the convenience of the storyteller.
Yes. Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
So there's a famous witch who's buried in a churchyard in a little village called Wood Plumpton near Preston in Lancashire, which is called Meg. And Meg was known by her local farming community as being able to turn into a goose or a milk jug, I think, at some point, and various other things. But that's not so much about having a familiar as about being able to change shape, about shape shifting into other things, to be able to do something. Okay. So it would be really, it's on the one hand really lovely to have all these tales of people being able to do these magical things, but actually I suspect that it's probably just convenient and fits the narrative. And if your barn's on fire and you see a dog run out of it, then the local witch clearly could turn into a dog.
To set your barn and that fits the narrative, doesn't it? For the quick question. We might get onto this, and I think I know the answer, but I just need it clarifying. If witchcraft is rooted in sort of or associated with the devil and Satan, is therefore all witchcraft perceived to be evil or not, or is there a contradictory sort of that says, is it witchcraft in terms of incantations, and could incantations be used to heal, or would they be herbalists, healers, etc. type thing, or is the association of witchcraft always evil, I suppose is what I'm asking?
Probably not. I mean, at the time of the witch trials, there was always a big population of people who were using charms and rhymes and herbal trinkets and tokens and things like that, who were very well tolerated and very well respected within their communities as being helpers.
Right.
They didn't necessarily run into trouble enough to be accused of consorting with the devil.
Yeah.
But modern witches are very cognizant of the fact that as human beings, we have great potential to do both harm and to do good.
Yeah.
And it's you mentioned the term white witch before, and I think the expectation of a white witch is someone who only does good things. But as humans, is it actually possible for us to only do good things? Is it possible not to swear at the traffic warden when they put a ticket on your windscreen and you're on the other side of the street and you're only 20 seconds late or whatever? We're not like that as humans. We have as much light as we do dark.
Yeah. And
that goes for all of us. There's no one who's either purely evil or purely good. And that's kind of what the modern witches, or many modern witches, would say. They are just as likely to cast a hex as they are to cast a healing spell.
So let me just take that one step further. And if you were to, I'm going to sound like a game show now, if you were to ask 100 people a survey, sort of thing, what percentage of people, how many do you think maybe would would perceive witchcraft as always being evil, because you've said there's the yin and the yang, there is the potential to be good and bad. I would suspect that you'd be talking a vast majority of people would always associate witchcraft and wizardry with, as you said, the dark arts and being evil. So now within the witch community and within the people that understand witchcraft, I suppose you're saying less so, but I suspect the general populace might be actually they just associate it with the dark arts and evil.
Yeah, I've absolutely no clue what the right answer to that question is.
Yeah, I'm just
I think you're right. The general population would probably err on the side of it's probably a bit evil.
Yeah.
But the witch community, whoever they are, would probably say that they're definitely not evil and have just the same potential for good and bad as everybody else.
Okay.
Indeed. So,
thank you. Do I get a prize now? Do I get a pressure cooker or something?
Yeah, we'll sort something out. We'll send you a TBR sticker or something.
Yeah, we'll send a beer or something. It's fine.
No, we're out of beer mats. So just to chime in there, Stuart has a question for us. So he's thinking about the likes of, and probably the name Meg triggered this in his mind, I suppose. Mystic Meg, who was obviously very famous when the Camelot first introduced the lottery into Britain, and obviously Glenn Hoddle was England manager as well. Would people like Mystic Meg be classed as witches? Do you think we turfed them back sort of 200 years? That kind of nonsense and that kind of looking into the future, would that be witchcraft, or would that be just some kind of clairvoyance, or would it be dismissed? I don't know.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know whether Mystic Meg would consider herself to be a witch. She might do. She might not. I don't know. She had great hair, but I don't remember much else about her. But definitely looking into a crystal ball and divining the future and guessing what numbers would come about very much falls under the Witchcraft Act, because it was all about, telling the future and stuff. Necromancy, for example, which we might come back to later if we've got the chance. Talking to the dead is generally seen as an okay thing in our culture, I think, but necromancy in law has always been forbidden when it's been about telling the future. So talk to dead people, but don't ask them what's going to happen tomorrow or with the lottery. So I don't know. You'd have to ask Mystic Meg whether she considers herself to be a witch or not. But I would imagine that with a public profile like she had in the 90s, if she'd had that in the 1590s, she might have found herself in some hot water.
I suspect she isn't, but wouldn't be cool if she was. Do you know what I mean? Because but as I say, I suspect if she was and she was back in the day, she might not have been quite as popular as she maybe as it was back in the 80s, 90s, or whenever it was. I don't even know when she was around, but.
No, but then it also depends whose numbers she was predicting. If she was predicting the king's numbers, she might have been having a very nice time. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Well, we have one further question which I feel obliged to ask because it comes from a previous guest before we move on to old Hellish Nell herself. Does Lynzie consider herself to be a witch? There's an interesting question. I'd like to hear the answer to that. Thank you very much for asking that one, Stephen Norton Burnett.
Oh, I think that this is actually that toffee crisp moment, because that chocolate wrapper has just floated down from the room right above me. I couldn't possibly say, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Steve.
We'll ask Stephen when he's on next time. He'll tell us, I think.
And he will be on again, so it's fine.
And he will be on again, yeah. It's already arranged.
So here's a question for you in that case. Who do you think is more bonkers, me with my witch stories or him with his fractals and Fibonacci sequence?
No, I tell you what,
that's a question.
Yeah. Your take on things and your take on life is probably a lot closer to where I am. As again, we chatted, Gaz, just before you joined us, and the idea that the purpose of my life is just purely to create a random number is utterly depressing. I know my life is pointless. I know it's really pointless. The stuff I get excited about, very, very pointless. I get it. You know what I mean? But the idea that all I am here is just to create another number for somebody who's far, far more important or even entirely significant in their universe is utterly depressing. But I tell you what, they're two diametrically opposed ideas, I think, in many ways. One comes back from folklore, one very much from right now thinking about almost futuristic style of thought that's asking us to think outside the box. And I'm looking forward, because I know we're going to plan an episode later in the year with the two of you on, where we're going to look at those two diametrically opposed. I don't know if Steve has told you that, but we've arranged it.
Okay.
These two diametrically opposed ideas and how they can unite into one relationship, one household. I'm fascinated to hear how that works, and then maybe try and apply some of that understanding to my own marriage. I don't know.
It's strange because not strange. That's the wrong phrase.
It's definitely strange.
No, I found it incredibly compelling, and I suppose being an IT teacher and understanding a little bit of software and programming and how you can program certain things to do not to that level, obviously, but very rudimentary. So I find it quite compelling, and I think I'm with Adam in just as much as I would hate to think that I'm just doing this, whatever this may be, just to be a number to create something for somebody else. However, it was quite a compelling argument to say, well, how do we know, sort of thing. So yeah, and actually it'd be really cool to get you both on and almost you duke it out across the room with each other. That'd be brilliant, and we'll just be we'll be the referees, and it's fun.
Oh God, no, it'll be awful. Awful and brilliant, because I've actually got the antidote, because after an hour of simulation theory, I think it's absolutely right to sell your soul to the devil.
Yeah.
Escape opportunity on a broomstick.
I give up. That's me done. I'm out.
I'm off.
Yeah, I'm off.
At least as a minion to the devil, my life will mean a little bit more than generating a random.
Exactly.
So speaking of those who have potentially done these evil deeds, hellish now, whose name I always seem to confuse. So it's Helen Duncan.
Helen Duncan.
Got it right. I got it wrong about 5 times before we were chatting. So Helen Duncan, yeah. I've got the name Helen Gordon in my mind from somewhere. If I know you, if you're listening, I apologise. So yeah, so Helen
Maybe coming through from the spirit world.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, who knows? Who knows? Maybe I need to explore that. So tell us a little bit about her and how she fell foul of this act that we've just been talking about.
Okay, just before I answer that, I'm going to get to the end of Gazza's question, because Gazza was asking how the Witchcraft Act had come into the 20th century.
Yes.
So what happened was we had the Witchcraft Act of 1735 that now made it a crime to pretend to be a witch rather than a crime to be a witch. So that stayed with us until Helen Duncan. Yes, Helen Duncan.
What did you say? You put it in everybody's head now. It's Helen Duncan.
Yes, Helen Duncan. Not Helen Gordon or whatever it was that you said.
Google it.
So that stayed until after her time, until 1951, where the Act was repealed, and it became the Fraudulent Mediums Act. So now it was nothing to do with witchcraft, but it was about, again, people pretending and conning people out of money, pretending to be talking to spirits, etc.
Right.
So they were fraudulent mediums. You could also be charged at the time under the Vagrancy Act, which was from 18 something or other, where kind of traveling fortune tellers and astrologers and things could be charged with quite petty crimes. But after 1950,
that was sorry to interrupt. That's what I was going to ask about the clairvoyancy, because obviously that's relatively popular even nowadays. Lots of people go to clairvoyance and this, that, and the other. So that then made me think, oh, okay. So back in the turn of the century, the clairvoyancy you could be charged with if you were doing that to effectively sort of swindle people out of money, then you could be charged under that act.
Yeah, well, interestingly, we talked briefly last time about Most Haunted and Derek Acora and the cash machine incident. But Derek Acora was sacked from Most Haunted in about 2005 because some of the researchers on the show had made up anagram names and fed them to him as people who had haunted the Bodmin jail.
Right.
And so he then channeled these fictional people and exposed himself as a fraud, as someone who was wow. giving out false information. So he was sacked from the BBC, and whilst he wasn't prosecuted in any way, shape, or form, probably his whatever he did would have come under this Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1951. Right. Okay. And very shortly after that, the Fraudulent Medium Acts went. That was repealed, and what we ended up with instead was a whole load of consumer protection regulations from the EU in the early 20th century. So we can go all the way from Henry VIII to consumer protection and mis-selling washing machines and products that didn't work and saying you could do things that you couldn't. So actually, yeah, if something's on TV and it's got mediums and stuff like that, I think it's supposed to have somewhere in its credits that it's for entertainment purposes only, not that this is absolutely true. We're definitely talking to your Aunt Sally from Doncaster.
I was going to say, I mean,
he's
got a pretty solid case for unfair dismissal, though, because the BBC must have been the only ones who didn't know he was making it up.
Where's the campus flame? That's what I want. Come on, Derek. Sort yourself out,
pal. Maybe he's trying to do that in the afterlife at the moment.
No. Maybe so.
Get in touch, Derek. Send down the toffee crisp.
So anyway, Helen Duncan, not Gordon. So Helen Duncan, or Nellie as she was known, was born in Scotland in 1897. So she was born to a very respectable family of a mum and a dad who were builders by trade, and they were also Presbyterian. So they were very strictly religious, very strictly Protestant, Puritan, Christian. And so all manner of sins and digressions were strictly forbidden. Now, she was one of 9 children, I believe. And when she was 16, for whatever reason, she was either seduced or assaulted or who knows what, but she became pregnant, and which for that kind of family at that time was absolutely scandalous. So she was banished and embarked on a career, if you like, as a single mother. So this was in 1914 at the start of the First World War. So she then embarked on this very hard, poor life. She went to work in a jute factory and a bleach factory. She did 10 to 12-hour shifts to feed herself and clothe her baby. She was very overweight for most of her life, I think, and was plagued by health difficulties. She had TB, which must have been really difficult. And a couple of years later, she married a man called Henry, who was a cabinet maker, but there wasn't much work around for him, and they continued to suffer on, they fell on hard times. She ultimately had 8 children. So they got married in 1916, and both of them were always ill with something or other. Poor Henry had been in the war; he had been wounded. After he left the army, he had a heart attack and a nervous breakdown. Nell herself, who the nickname Hellish Nell, if you've heard of that, came from her kind of naughty willfulness as a child, rather than anything to do with the trial later on. But as a child, she was always seeing ghosts and talking to spirits, and she had what she described as a very, very close and faithful relationship with God. So anyway, the kind of sad circumstances of their life continued. She took in washing and laundry to help feed the family. And so you can kind of start to see why spiritualism became more and more appealing to her, and then actually became quite a savvy career move, if you like. And she started in the 1920s to practice seances, started talking more and more to the undead. The undead, the dead, the actual dead. The zombies hadn't been invented then, I don't think.
No, zombies didn't exist in pre-1940. There was never a thing.
Although it could be now.
Well,
Do something with that. So she was a medium in that the dead spoke through her, and she started to hone this talent where spirits came to her and gave messages to people through voices from her mouth. She claimed to be able to read the past by touching objects, which apparently were put in her hands by the dead people. She could predict when deaths would happen. She could absorb apparently sickness from other people, thus curing them, which is quite a talent to have when it's really expensive to get a doctor in pre NHS.
Yeah.
And also in her chats with dead people, she managed to give quite a lot of comfort to people who had lost loved ones. At the time, the First World War had finished, and in the war, literally millions and millions of the men of Europe were killed. Whole families lost their menfolk, their fathers, sons, brothers. And then the Second World War came and brought the whole lot back again. So in the culture of that time, there was a lot of thought. Death was literally all around, and people needed some comfort, which they didn't really see as coming from the mainstream church. And that the spiritualist church grew quite rapidly during that time. So spiritualism celebrated this kind of contact that they had with the dead. And between the wars, I believe there's a statistic that says something like 35% of the British public believed that it was actually possible to commune with the dead, to speak to your lost relatives, etc.
Wow.
I wonder what that percentage would look like today, just out of interest. I wonder how many people believe in that today.
I wonder. Well, there's quite a significant number of people who on the census describe themselves as being Jedi, aren't there? So
yeah.
Which sounds a little disrespectful.
A lot of what they say, though.
but it would be interesting. It'd be interesting to try to distinguish between. And it might be hard. Conversing with the dead, in terms of being a conduit for the dead people to speak through you as such, or associating certain things with the dead, or perceiving or what you perceive to be a ghost or the dead, because there's different things in this. Lots and lots of people, I suspect, if you said, have you seen a ghost or have you seen the dead, or a lost relative or lost family member, whatever, would probably say yes. Have you conversed with them? I suspect the number is much lower, and actually it's no. So is it more of just a sight thing as opposed to a conversational thing? Because lots of people say, yeah, I've seen a ghost, or yes, I've seen the dead, or yes, I've seen my dead grandmother or mum or dad or aunt or brother, whoever it may be. Have you actually conversed with those, and have you been able to communicate with those? Well, no, I haven't. Do you know what I mean? So I suspect that those figures would be, it'd be interesting to find out, but potentially higher in terms of have you seen somebody, as opposed to slightly lower in terms of have you actually conversed with them and have you spoken to them.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Steve and I were talking about this in the car this afternoon. We were talking about this idea of necromancy, and necromancy is quite literally communing with the dead. And people used to believe that you could summon the spirits up from the grave and send them out to do things for you. And it sounds really kind of far-fetched and ridiculous that you could actually talk to a dead person. But even in our times, we do it quite often. So we would go to a graveside of our family member, and we don't just go to tidy up and get the weeds off and throw the old flowers away. We go there in the expectation that we're actually going to spend some time with that person in that person's space. And we see more and more these, as we drive down roads, we see accident sites where people take things and they leave flowers, and at Christmas you can see Christmas gifts, you can see football scarves and all kinds of things that are put there for that person. So we do, even now in 2024, have an ongoing relationship with the dead people around us. So it's always like it's a kind of continuing human need, rather than just something that was consigned to the ridiculous practices of people who've gone before.
But it is that, and I'm going to use a phrase now, and it possibly is that sort of play devil's advocate. Is it when you see like the teddy bears or the football scarves or the flowers, or is that a way of remembering them, or is that a way of you still feeling as a that place or that roadside or that building or that church, whatever maybe, is that a way of you communicating with them, or is that just a way of holding them in your memory? And I don't know the answer, I suppose.
No, I don't know, and I'm lucky enough not to have had that experience where I need to commemorate someone in that way. But if it was just for me, if it was just about memory, I could do that here in my home, rather than in that place which now has a whole load of different meaning.
It's different meaning, absolutely, yeah.
That I would then take those kind of gifts or offerings to that person in that place.
Yeah. I get that. I understand that. Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, back to Helen. So she also developed a relationship with a spirit guide. So this is almost kind of going back to this idea of familiars. She had various spirit guides. The first and foremost of whom would be Dr. Williams, and he was a very posh gentleman who spoke to her, and he taught her how to set up the environment in her house. So she would have a sectioned off curtained area in the living room, with a black curtain and a red lamp, and he told her to create a speaking trumpet so she could speak with the voice of the other spirits that were coming through. I think he also probably told her about ectoplasm, which we'll come back to later. She had another spirit guide called Peggy, and Peggy would quite often materialize, whether she actually did materialize or she was made out of paper and cloth. Who knows? If you're interested, there's some amazing photos that you can find. If you just do a Google image search for Helen Duncan and ectoplasm, you get to see the people that she's materialized, and to us they just look completely crazy. But many people entirely believed in them back in the day.
Some of those photographs, and I have seen them myself, I have to say, I find it difficult to believe that she then got prosecuted off of the back of them, because they weren't very convincing to me.
Quite. So at her seances, she gradually became more and more famous, and she moved around quite a lot doing seances in churches and things, and eventually she wound up in Portsmouth. And Portsmouth, as you know, is a big, famous naval town. And in 1941, she made I don't know, what do you call it, a prediction, or she manifested the spirit of a sailor. And the sailor told her that his ship had been sunk, and gave her various messages. And he told her that he was from the HMS Barham, which had been torpedoed at the beginning of the war, and about 850 sailors had died as the ship sank. And this was probably just kind of one of those things that she thought was a a good story, but the problem was that nobody officially knew that the HMS Byron had been sunk. The government didn't make it public because it was it was quite early in the war, not great for morale. The relatives of the people who had drowned and gone down with the ship had been informed. And if you look on Wikipedia, it says that roughly about 9,000 people in the entire country knew. But it also makes the point that if 9,000 people each told a friend, that would be 18,000 people. And if they told 2 more people, that would be 36,000 people, or whatever Steve will tell me off for my maths if I go down that route any further.
And then it grows exponentially after that. Whatever.
Yeah, you get it, don't you? I know that he's listening because the toffee crisps are raining down. So yeah, it seems on the one hand, the government line was that nobody knew, and on the other, there were lots of people who actually did.
Yeah.
But at some point, there was a lieutenant from the Naval Volunteer Service who started attending her séances. And he kind of, a bit like the whole Derek Akora thing on Most Haunted, he kind of asked leading questions and she gave him false information back, and he exposed her as a fraud. And ultimately, she was arrested along with a few other people who belonged to this spiritualist church that she'd gone to do the seances at Portsmouth. And the local magistrates initially wanted to charge them under the Vagrancy Act, which was the one from the 19th century that kind of could prosecute people guilty of petty crimes like telling fortunes and astrology and what have you. But actually, it kind of just escalated, and there was a concern about public safety, about exploiting recently bereaved people, about giving away government secrets, and this whole kind of intelligence angle came about out of this story of the boat being sunk that nobody knew about. And so it got escalated to the Old Bailey, and they ended up being tried under the 1732 Witchcraft Act instead of the Vagrancy Act. So in 1944, you have this little bunch of people from Portsmouth being put on trial as witches. Now, one of the most interesting things, I think, is that Stanley Worth was the one who exposed her at the seances, and he never really, I don't believe that he admitted exactly why he was there, whether he was actually really interested in spiritualism himself, or whether there was a theory that he was a government spy and he was out to find people who were talking too loudly, if you like, or saying the wrong things in the wrong places. But they were arrested initially for fraud, and poor Helen, or Nellie as she was known, was chucked into Holloway for 5 days. And then she was assigned a defence lawyer, and his name was Charles Loseby. Now, Charles was another quite well-to-do gentleman. He had served in the army and got to the rank of captain in the Lancashire Fusiliers. He was awarded the Military Cross for his services in the war, where he was gassed and wounded. He had quite a difficult life health-wise as well. In 1918, he became an MP. But the most interesting thing of all was that he was an ardent spiritualist. So he actually believed in the mediums and the things that they could do, and the ectoplasm and the mystique and everything. So he actually loathed Helen and the other people she was on trial with, and he was really quite disparaging and disrespectful about them. He described them as, well, in a word, pretty stupid. He encouraged the jury to dismiss any suspicion of fraud, basically because they were they weren't clever enough to be able to do it. So he had this kind of dual aim to dismiss the charges of fraud, but also to forward belief in spiritualism, because he really believed in it. So it's a really bizarre situation to be in a courtroom in the Old Bailey in 1944.
Bizarre.
Incredible.
That is bizarre. That is
It is
bizarre.
it is. Yeah, it's in a way it makes you think. Okay, so if that happened then, what are the things that are going on now, and potentially what are the things that are going on now that some people could be either tried for or not? And if there's nothing that they could be tried for now, then why don't you go back to look back in the day and get tried under an old law that actually now it's not been superseded or whatever? Because I'm assuming there's still lots of laws from back in the day that actually either haven't been updated or just been long forgotten. But if there's something that happens now that you think, well, actually, we can't get you on this, but hey, back in the 1700s, there was a law that said this, we can get you on that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, the law was still in statute, the Witchcraft Act. So whilst they weren't just people they could say were telling fortunes or what have you, and they clearly weren't vagrants, they were in fact pretending, as it were, or that was the accusation, to conjure spirits and to commune with the dead, and all of those other things that did still stand under the Witchcraft Act, even though it wasn't to last much longer.
Yeah.
So it's crazy, really. And then the British government kind of had an interest because they wondered whether this person was actually giving away secrets and sharing intelligence that the public didn't know about. I mean, they couldn't really charge her with anything practical around that, with treason or anything like that, because that would be literally to say that the words that she spoke and the things that she did were true. So the Witchcraft Act was a lot more appropriate and convenient, I guess.
Are you familiar with the song "The Last Witch of England" by Seventh Son? Have you heard that?
I've heard of it, but I don't know the song.
No. Well, I wasn't. No, it crossed my mind, but frankly, every time that I've pinned something and shared it on here, I've got stinking letters off YouTube telling me to stop doing it. So
don't do that.
I was just to rather read out the introduction than actually finally get some litigation from YouTube. So it starts off in 19 because it's a voiceover. It's a very sort of 70s prog rock feel to it. In 1944, medium Helen Duncan became the last woman in Britain to be convicted of witchcraft, when one of her seances exposed a government attempt to cover up the deaths of 861 sailors. The way she was hounded to death remains a scandal. So, I mean, that's a very different take on it than the one we've heard a little bit, where, you know, we can question her authenticity. We can question whether she genuinely was a witch and what she did. But in many ways, the real crux of the matter, like you said there, was the exposing of government secrets. And that's where she really got herself into mischief, wasn't it?
Allegedly, yeah. I suppose. But did she really give away a government secret, or did she just let slip in a way that enabled her to sell tickets at £12 a head on a Saturday night? That's what many people in the country already knew, because a couple of months had passed since the incident, and word gets out, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And there are stories of quite high up people leaking that information straight from the Navy.
Yeah, I think was it Winston Churchill who said something like, "A lie can get halfway around the world before the truth has even had a chance to put its pants on," or something like that.
Yeah.
So certainly something like that, which is, you know, could be seen as speculation, I suspect. Although you say, you know, exponentially it spread, it probably spread like wildfire, didn't it? Really,
Yeah, absolutely.
The press was a very different animal back then, I imagine.
Yeah, so I think that it's very unlikely that she was intentionally giving away intelligence that really wasn't for everybody's ears. It was probably common knowledge she was in Portsmouth. I mean, if she'd been in rural Derbyshire or something, or what have you, a million miles from the sea and a million miles from the Navy, it would be realistic to think she may have got that information from the spirit world, not from like the local tea shop or something.
So there's an appeal that runs even to this day, though, isn't there, to have her posthumously pardoned?
Yeah, well, in fact, there's an appeal or a petition or whatever you want to call it to have all of the witches pardoned, because even when the 1732 Act was dreamt up, they accepted then that witchcraft was an impossible crime. You couldn't possibly kill somebody by putting a spell on them. And in fact, a lot of the people who died of witchcraft died very long and kind of painful deaths of terminal diseases, rather than of being kind of struck down by a bolt of thunder or what have you. I don't think there's any record anywhere of someone dying immediately from a curse. And John Law, who was the guy who Alison devised of the Pendle Witches curse, was the only one who suffered any immediate effects, and chances are he just probably had a stroke that he was going to have anyway. But who knows? But in that lyric that you just quoted, Adam, it said she was then hounded to death. But the thing is, she got sentenced to 9 months in jail for fraud after the trial. But then when she came out, she was arrested again a couple of years later for holding more seances. So I don't really feel that that's strong evidence that she was hounded to death. However, some people believe that when she died, the reason that she died was that the police disturbed her while she was in a trance, and she was exuding all this ectoplasm all over the place. And when the police disturbed her, it made her jump, and all the ectoplasm sprang back into her body, and that's how she died, of the impact of the ectoplasm. Which sounds completely bonkers, doesn't it? But maybe it's true. Who knows?
Well, it does. So I know when we spoke at the start, you said that maybe, just maybe, you'd give us a recipe for ectoplasm. So perhaps the recall of this, shall we say, manufactured ectoplasm. I'm not suggesting in her case it wasn't real, although it was a good. It wasn't. Maybe that is what the recall of that into her body, or recoil into her body, may have actually caused some physical damage, couldn't it, potentially?
I would probably say so, given what it was actually made of. So shall we kind of finish with the recipe for ectoplasm?
Yeah, and a disclaimer, just in case YouTube are listening, don't try this at home.
Do not. So what you need to gather together in your little ectoplasm shopping list is a whole load of cheesecloth or muslin cloth, like meters and meters and meters of the stuff. You can twist it up, you can wrap it around you, whatever, but you need loads of it. You need a load of egg white. You need various chemicals, whatever those are. You need a whole load, probably nearly as much as the material, of chewed up toilet roll. And the most important ingredient is a load of cut off heads from magazine and newspaper articles to put in your mix. So there's a few eyes and noses and faces in there. You mix it all up. I don't know whether you mix it up in a bucket or you just mix it with your hands or what have you. But then you eat it. And you can eat it to regurgitate later at your seances, and you can pull it out of your mouth, you can pull it out of your nose. Obviously, you can make all kinds of horrible and convincing spiritual type noises as you're doing this behind your black curtain with your red lamp and your speaking trumpet. You can pull it out of various body parts, really, for whatever's convenient for you and whatever your preference is. But what you really have to do is make sure that you can snatch it back quickly when the police come in to arrest you.
I tell you what, having seen Ghostbusters and the ectoplasm in there, I would much rather produce that from my body.
Chewed up toilet roll.
Yeah, the chewed up toilet over newspaper and cheesecloth. I had my fill of cheesecloth when I had kids and wiping up their puke. The idea of ingesting it, absolutely not. No,
Not good, is it?
It just sounds horrendous.
You have to be really committed to your ticket sales.
That's the understatement. That is, I tell you what.
So
You must-
interestingly, in the last time at the end, I told you the story about the boy who was late home, who went on an adventure with the witches on horseback and with greyhounds, etc. And the witches that end up being accused by him and his dad in the aftermath of that were sent to London to be examined by prominent doctors and midwives of the day, and they underwent these horrible physical examinations where they had every part of them examined to look for witches' marks and evidence. And various people, psychic investigators and scientists, examined Helen or Nellie at various points and tried to prove that she had ectoplasm that could come out of her, and they tried to put her in X-ray machines and things to see what they could see inside her body, but lo and behold, every time she managed to escape or hit someone or run away. She was asked to swallow what's it called? It's like a blue chemical that you can add to things. She was asked to swallow that, but unfortunately on that occasion, no ectoplasm could appear, because if she had swallowed it, the toilet roll and the cloth would come out blue. Was it gentian? Maybe it was gentian.
Something like that, I think it's called. Yeah.
Yeah, so no empirical evidence of Nell's ability to produce ectoplasm appeared. And unfortunately, there was one really comical experiment where some men waited with scissors for the ectoplasm to start coming out so that they could chop it off, but none was produced, and she ran away or beat them with a handbag or something. So whether hellish Nell died at the hands of her own ectoplasm, or whether she just suffered a rather mundane death due to heart problems, we probably won't know.
No, that's it. As you said at the start there, you know, she was in rather poor health anyway, and I don't imagine ingesting things like that would have helped in any way whatsoever with anybody's health. So
Probably not.
it's a sad story, I think, to be honest with you. And you know what I mean? Whatever her intentions were, you know, as I guess our own desire to be remembered. She's been successful in some ways in that everybody knows her tale now, that we've been able to share it now, sort of 80 years on in the future. We can talk about her and remember her, and that's better than just generating a random number in another universe, isn't it?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
I do think so. So with that, we trail many episodes to come, because that's another 2 planned in there. Just in case you're unaware, Stephen Houghton Burnett, is that his correct pronunciation of his surname?
Houghton Burnett.
Houghton. He did tell me I might have that one wrong as well. Yeah, so that is.
We call various things in his time. Houghton Burnett is probably one of the most polite.
That's it. I for me to comment. But yeah, so he is your other half, and he was on a couple of episodes ago. So that episode will, if you're watching on the live stream, will be dropping this weekend. If you're listening, then it was a couple of weekends ago. So we hope you enjoyed that one. And tonight, I tell you what, you've had your value for money. Bear in mind, it's a free podcast as well, because we normally call things to a stop round about an hour mark, but we've really enjoyed this one. And we've really enjoyed hearing the story of, like we say, the last witch of Scotland. So it's been an interesting story.
Eventually, didn't we?
We did. We did. But we always get diverted along the way. That's the Tall Boy Radio way, isn't it, Gaza?
There's always a left turn sooner or later, and if you listen to us long enough, there's probably more than one. So yeah, we got there in the end, and if you left turn often enough, then you end up absolutely back where you started. So I've thoroughly enjoyed this episode. It's great when we have guests on and the educators in things that we're unaware of and we haven't heard of, and it's fascinating just to chat to yourself, Lynzie, and all the guests that we have on. Thoroughly enjoyed this episode. Can't wait for the next time that we have Lynzie on, and we'll be talking about something completely different, no doubt.
Well, it's already arranged. I don't think Lynzie knows what we're going to be talking about. I've arranged it with Stephen, though.
From the fortunes, that's where we go.
Exactly. So, Lynzie, would you like to say your goodbyes to our listeners and leave us with any final thoughts that you have?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, for spending another evening talking about witches with me. Please don't eat the toilet roll. And if you do, make sure it doesn't kind of all splat back at you in a horrible, gory, untimely toilet roll death. But yeah, there's loads of really interesting books and stuff to read about Hellish Nell and her story. It's a lot more intricate and a lot more political than I've been able to cover today. I spent most of my time talking about ancient laws. But thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure. And if you want to find out more about Lynzie, you can head to pendlecore.com. Am I correct in saying that's the website?
Yeah, or on Instagram.
Or on Instagram at Pendlecore, as you will see there if you're watching it on the video. I would recommend doing so because it is very, very interesting stories that you can hear about witchcraft. And it's something that interests me because, you know, to understand where we're going, to understand where we are and the people that we are today, we need to understand a little bit about the past and the characters that formed us. And clearly, that still carries on into the present when we're talking about the 1940s and onwards. And we're still looking back at these people and getting repealed. And that probably is what needs to happen because these people, you know, if you believe in witchcraft, maybe they perhaps did deserve to be punished. If you didn't believe in it, maybe they didn't. But that is indeed for another day. So thank you very much for tuning in. We'll catch you next week when no doubt we'll be talking about something very different altogether.